Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Data Colada Seminar Series. I'm Leif Nelson, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Alex Todorov. We're also joined by a wonderful set of panelists, John Freeman, Dong-Won Oh, Alice O'Toole, Claire Sutherland, and Marilla Walker. And as you'll see, if you haven't attended one of these before, there's a Q&A function which allows you to submit questions or comments, which can be read by any of the panelists here. When we have a chance, we will interrupt Alex and voice some of those to him. Even if we don't get to your questions and comments, they're all recorded and we can deliver them to him at the end of the session. Beyond that, I'm going to give the floor to Alex, and we'll all be here for the next hour to listen to what he has to say. Thanks a lot, Alex. It's all yours.
Yeah. Okay, well, first, thank you, Uri and Leif and Joe for inviting me, and thank you to everybody in the panel, Alice and Mirella and Claire and John, and of course, okay, my slide wasn't advancing, and special thanks go for Dong-Won, who is also on the panel, and the substance of everything that I'm going to say today is in a chapter co-authored with him. The chapter will appear in Advancing Experimental Social Psychology early next year, but it's posted on my website if you're interested in the details. So in 2008, we published a paper that I consider still one of the most important papers to come out of my lab. And we actually tried to accomplish two things. The first thing was to suggest a reduced dimensional model of social judgments of faces because they're very highly correlated. And the second was, in fact, to introduce data-driven computational models that visualize impressions. I always consider the second part way more important than the first, but somehow the first part became better known, perhaps because it was much simpler to understand. But one way to think about these two objectives is, in the first objective was to build this psychological space of social judgments. And you can think of mapping this social judgment space to physical face space. This is the modeling part. And Alice, who is on the panel, has done tons of work on this, and she has written extensively on these different spaces. And actually, as I said, I really have focused in the last 12 years or so on the methods part, the second part, but somehow this was brought to my attention. There was this highly complex multi-lab project that tested whether our two-dimensional model generalizes to world regions outside of the typical Western regions, like United States, UK, and Canada. And so here is the beginning of the abstract of the paper, that might be very close to the final version, which will be published in Nature Human Behavior. This was a huge undertaking, and I'm extremely grateful to the authors for collecting this incredible data set. So here's the beginning of the abstract. Over the last 10 years, Osterhoff and Todorov's valence dominance model has emerged as the most prominent account of how people evaluate face and social dimensions. In this model, two dimensions, balance and dominance, underpin social judgments of faces. Because this model has primarily been developed and tested in Western regions, it is unclear whether these findings apply to other regions. We address this question by replicating Osterhoff and Todorov's methodology across 11 world regions, 41 countries, more than 11,000 participants. When we used Osterhoff and Todorov's original analysis strategy, the valence dominance model generalized across regions. I mean, let me just say that, first of all, it's not obvious at all why it should generalize. And at least the way I understand the objective of these projects, which I wasn't part of it, but I was involved at least in the initial stages to share opinion, provide advice, wasn't to test whether the model is real or not, because it has already been replicated here. It has been replicated by some of the lead authors in the UK, and the question was, and already, I mean, Claire, who's in the panel, has done also work, similar work, replicating this model and finding some interesting novel dimensions. But the point is that it's a very interesting question. It's not does it exist? Does it hold well? But does it generalize to other cultures? And I'll get later to these regions why you wouldn't expect necessarily. So this wasn't the part that, so this part obviously was somewhat nice, I suppose. But then this is now the secondary exploratory analysis. And the abstract says when we used an alternative methodology to allow for correlated dimensions, we observe much less generalization. Collectively, these results suggest that while the valence dominance model generalizes very well across regions when dimensions are forced to be orthogonal, regional differences are revealed when we use different extraction methods and so on and so on. So now the difference is actually the regional analysis, principal components analysis, and this alternative analysis, exploratory factor analysis. And let me make, so this is built with my methods part of my talk, but let me make my motivation clear from the get-go. I'm not really concerned whether the simplistic two-dimensional model we introduced is the right one. I'm pretty sure that it's not, or at the very least it's incomplete. And I mean, we can talk about this later, but Claire has already shown that there's more dimensions. You need to account for judgments, and really anybody who has ever done work with principal components analysis or factor analysis knows that the most important decision is the input to this analysis. So if you have different list of attributes, you will end up with different solutions. So I'm not concerned with this. I never cared about my models as like my models. I mean, it's just, they're models, they're descriptive, simple descriptive pictures. But what I'm concerned is about dubious claims that behavioral science results are determined by arbitrary analytic choices. And this is one implication. Well, it replicates if we do this, but if we do something different, things are all over the place. Now notice that I'm talking about, so my belief is, and I'll get to this back, is that if the analytic choices are properly specified, analysis should converge in terms of broader claims, not in terms of the specifics of the models, but in terms of broader claims about what's shared, what's unique, and so on. And let me get, before I move to my to the substance of my talk, let's just get this out of the way. Nothing that they talk about here, it's about the accuracy of impressions. This is all about perceptions. And one way to understand the models that we've built for visualizing of impression is to think of them as models that capture human biases and judgments. So let's just take this out of the way. So here's the outline of the talk. First, I will talk about the original work. So I'll give you a little bit context before I get into the details. And then I will talk about the cross-cultural replication a little bit. Then, since all of the differences come from using two different methods, principal components analysis, PCA, and exploratory factor analysis, I'm going to delve a little bit on the major differences between these methods. And then I'll suggest a procedure that can fix a number of indeterminacies inherent in factor analysis. And then it appears that it doesn't matter what sorts of analysis you use. If the analytic choices are properly specified, there is good evidence for cross-cultural universality. So what you see here is a scatter plot of different pairs of social judgments. So each face is a point. And this is a basic fact of social perception. Anybody who has measured or collected trait ratings of faces knows that they're hugely correlated. So faces who are perceived to be trustworthy are perceived also to be more intelligent, more attractive, less aggressive, more emotionally stable, and so on. And the correlations are pretty sizable. And so then, if that's the case, and this is what provided the motivation for the first part of our paper in 2008, it should be possible to find a simple dimensional space that accounts for the majority of judgments. So you're just looking for dimensionality reduction technique.
Sorry,
Now,
Alex, before you go on, a tiny point of clarification. The chart you were showing just previously, is that a special feature of faces, or is that if you judge a person to be trustworthy, you tend to judge them as intelligent or attractive and so on? I'm just wondering, is this about faces or about trustworthiness?
That's a great point. I mean, I think this generally would be the case for people in general, especially if you don't have knowledge. And I mean, John, who is on the panel, has done work on this. There's some individual differences in people's beliefs, but there's also rich work from the 70s on implicit personality theory, because personality constructs are correlated, but even if you ask people to make hypothetical judgments, you will get sizable correlations. So yeah, I don't have data to say this is something specific about faces. Okay, so the first question is, what is the input to your analysis? As I mentioned, this is the most important decisions you are making if you're going to trying to come up with some simple dimensional space. And back then, rather than relying on our hunches, we provided faces to participants and asked them to write whatever comes to their mind. And we reduced this to 13 trait attributes. Then these attributes were given to 13 different group of participants, so we get lots of ratings. So imagine you have an array of faces, and each face has 13 attributes. This average ratings from people. And so when you do a principal components analysis, and this is what we did back then, the first two principal components account for more than 80% of the variance. And the first we interpreted as valence/trustworthiness. I will show you in a second why we did this. The second is power dominance. This is consistent with many other dimensional models and goes all the way back to the work of Charles Osgood and his colleagues from the 50s. Why did we do PCA? Well, because I like simplicity, and this will come again later in my talk, but PCA is as simple as it gets in terms of dimension reduction techniques, and it's transparent. And we didn't have any specific, we didn't really have any theoretical model to say, well, there's these latent factors that you would posit in a factor analysis. And so we just went with the simplest available method. So what does it mean to have a two-dimensional space? Well, now you can essentially use this space to locate every single face. So if you look here, this face would be very high in the first dimension, will be perceived as highly trustworthy, but not as very dominant. You can also plot different traits, and you can express these traits as function of underlying dimensions. So you can see that attractiveness is correlated with both dimensions. But threat, on the other hand, is positively correlated with dominance, the second dimensions, but not with threat, not with trustworthiness, sorry. And in fact, the angle between any two vectors here, it indicates their correlation or their closeness in space. So you can see that judgments of trustworthiness are very, very close to the first dimensions. And that's why we went with this interpretation. This is another way to show it. We can actually do PCA on all of the judgment excluding trustworthiness and dominance. And then we can correlate the principal component score of the first component with trustworthiness. And you can see that although this judgment is not part of the input of the model, it's highly correlated with the first component, but not with the second. The correlation is weak. And the other way around for dominance. There's a weak negative correlation with the first component, but a very strong positive correlation with the second. So this is the rationale of the model. This is just, before 2020, the last time I talked about this model was back in 2007. As I said, I've really focused on the methods. In fact, in this picture, the person on my right is Nick Osterhoff. The guy I'm holding is now my height. And I had a lot of hair back then. And all of my lab members are either tenured faculty member or about to be tenured or working in the industry. So we sort of, we never looked back into this work. But as part of Dongkwon's dissertation, he actually collected data on the same ratings of the same faces. Not because we were interested whether the model will replicate, but because Dongkwon was interested in differences between evaluation of male and female faces. But as a result of this, we needed to collect new data sets because back in 2008, we didn't collect individual difference measures and other measures. And it was nice to have a more modern data set. Now, on your left, you see the data from 2008. On your right, you see the data from 2019. And this is just two pairs of judgments. In this case, trustworthy and emotionally stable, and intelligent and weird. And the second one, the point is that the scatter plots look very much identical. And in fact, these are all of the pairwise correlations. So if you look at the scatter plots, this is from 2008, and this is from 2019. And you can compute the Spearman rank order correlations. You can look at this as one vector of correlations, as another vector. And this Spearman rank order correlation is 0.94. These maps are actually very important because this should be clear later, especially in my talk when I look at the cross-cultural replication. But this is your input to both PCA and EFA. That's it. I mean, you work with correlation, and this is your original input. Before you get to any analytic choices, you can think of this is your descriptive statistics. This is your descriptive statistics that you would fit into any model. So the model replicates nicely. This is just to get a sense of what the principal components look like. In principal components, this is also very easy to understand. The loading is simply the correlation of the trait with the principal component. And in the first principal component, all positive judgments have positive weights like attractive, caring. All negative have negative ratings. So hence we interpret this as valence / trustworthiness. And the second component, dominance, has the highest loading, and then confidence, aggressive, mean, and so on. But I would be focusing for this talk on another measure because it's a nice quantitative measure that summarizes the relationship between two principal components. So X and Y in this formula, you can think these are the weights in the X of the component in 2008, and I will be comparing this component with 2019, okay? And so this is the measure. It's called factor congruence coefficient. The maximum is one, and the convention is if two factors are considered the same, if the factor congruence coefficient is above 0.95, two factors are considered structurally equivalent. If they're below 95 but above 85, factors are considered very similar. So when we compute this, you can see that in fact, there's a very, very high congruence. There's an asterisk here on after Procrustes rotation, and this is an important character to appear shortly in our little replication drama. But for now, I just want to say it doesn't make any difference because it's the same ratings, it's exactly the same phases, so and the PCA is highly robust. Back then, we didn't do factor analysis because, as I said, we didn't have any prior theoretical notions of what are the, whether there's some latent factors or not, and because PCA is much simpler. But if you do exploratory factor analysis with oblique rotation, which allows for the two factors to be correlated, this is exactly the procedure used in the replication project. Nothing changes much. I mean, the first factor again will be you can interpret it as valence. All positive judgment have positive weights. All negative judgment have negative weights. The second factor now, it's again dominance is with the highest loading, but the second finding, the second factor becomes a little bit more evaluatively negative. So aggressive has a much higher weight, confidence not so much. So in fact, these two factors are negatively correlated, and we have independent data that this. This factor solution, this factor correlates more with judgments of threat than the second principal component. But this is like small nuances. It's not that important. Again, we can compute the factor congruence coefficients, and what we end up having is they're highly, highly congruent. And it's not surprising. I mean, it's not surprising after you have seen the descriptive data, which is the pairwise correlations. That's what you would expect. If you see something else, there's something strange going on. So to summarize this first part of the talk, irrespective of the analysis on our own data, the solutions are very similar. The first factor component could be interpreted as valence, the second as power threat, though in the EFA solution, the factor analysis solution, the second factor acquires more evaluative negative meaning. The two solutions are structurally identical from these two data collections more than 10 years apart. Now we come to the cross-cultural replications. So I mentioned this in the beginning, but a priori, it's not obvious at all that the model would or should generalize. And in fact, it wasn't clear to me. I mean, I'm happy that it generalized, but I certainly wouldn't have been offended if, in fact, it was holding well in Western cultures, but not in Asia or in Africa, for that matter. So the first most important theoretical difference is that there might be genuine cultural differences. We're all being told that psychology is weird. That is, the majority of our studies are with Western educated participants from Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic countries. And hence it's not obvious that whatever we find in the lab with these participants or online with them Turk will generalize to big chunks of the world. Then you have a totally methodological differences. You have 41 countries that comprise these 11 regions with lots of different languages, and there might be subtle differences in the interpretation of trade terms. Third, you have a different set of faces. We used about 66 Caucasian faces, actually from Sweden. So they're all Caucasian faces. And here, the replication project used, I believe, was a larger number of faces, but it's 4 different ethnicities. So it's a much more diverse set of faces. So let's look at the factor congruence coefficients. This is from the table of the manuscript when you do PCA. So when you do PCA, you look for every single region. The first principal component is equal in every single. So it generalizes across every single culture. That's, I guess it's good in terms of if you really care about your model generalizing to other cultures. The second component, the data, not as great, but as great as it gets, I would say. So the only region that falls below threshold is Asia, but the threshold is 0.85. That always reminds me, Robert Abelson, great book Statistics as Principled Argument, where he says, well, God surely loves 0.06 just as much as 0.05. But let's not split hair here. Now, what happens now? Something completely different happens when you do exploratory factor analysis. Okay, first, so this actually is this table is no longer part, I believe, in the latest manuscript, but it gives you a good sense what's happening. First, it's all over. So it's kind of a mess if you think in terms of the replication of the model, it is a kind of a mess. But second, it's a bit of an incoherent mess, because if I take these coefficients at face value, it looks like that the data from Africa are much more similar to the data from Princeton than the data from UK and USA and Canada. But the table is meaningless, and it's meaningless for the following reason. When you're doing principal components analysis, it doesn't matter how many principal components you extract. I can extract 2 or 5 or 10 components. That doesn't change the initial components. So whatever the loadings is of the variables in the first 2 components, it stays the same. Whether I say, no, I want 3 components or I want 4 components, that just stays the same. With factor analysis, it doesn't. So the moment you extract a 3rd component or a 4th component, the weights change. And this is what is happening. Here you have, in some cases, you extract 3 factor solution and another 4 and a third 2, and then you compare solutions that have different dimensions. And that just doesn't work. It's like comparing apple and oranges. Interestingly enough, there's another table that is left over, which tells you what is the loadings of trustworthiness on the first factor and the second, and the same for dominance. But that is just equally meaningless. It's equally meaningless because these loadings change. As I'm extracting more dimensions, the loadings change. So you need to a priori specify, and that's a judgment call, I grant that you have the factor matrices within the same dimensional space to make any meaningful comparisons. So we'll get again back to these differences. But while I was struggling to understand what is going on I forgot the most important lesson I give all my undergraduate and graduate students, at least in terms of analysis. And that is, before you show me, and that's what I tell them, don't show me an inferential test of results derived from some complex procedure. Look at the descriptive data. Show me the descriptive data. Show me the input that goes into this analysis. Because ultimately, if you don't see anything there, anything that you show me later is just nonsense. And this is what I've always believed in terms of data analysis. So let's look at the descriptive data. Well, this is the correlations. For every region, this is the pairwise correlation of all 13 judgments. Two things should be noted. A, there's striking convergence across cultures. The patterns of correlations are very, very similar. Second, if I look, what is the correlation between the vector of our correlation in every single region? Well, they're pretty high. The lowest one is in the Middle East, which is 0.88, and in every other region is above 0.92. Now, I have to acknowledge this is combined data set of our 2008 and the 2019 replication. You can do the same only with the 2008 data, and things are pretty much the same, although the magnitude of the correlations goes a little bit lower. So for the Middle East would be 0.84, and instead of 92, the next one will be 0.90. This makes sense. I still find it more prudent to work with the combined data set because I have a better measurement and I have a better estimate of the correlations and everything else that goes into these stats. So how is it now? How is it that if we have, let me just stop for a second. This is probably the most important slide, not probably, this is the most important slide you're going to see in my presentation. So if you can ignore everything else, but this is the important slide. This is the descriptive statistic that goes to the input and it shows striking convergence across cultures. And that kept bugging me. How is it that you have the same input to the data, which is highly convergent, and you end up with such a different interpretations if you do principal component analysis and exploratory factor analysis? Well, I couldn't quite get my head ahead of this. And so I started reading more and more on methods. So PCA I knew very well, and I had some superficial knowledge of factor analysis, but I had to delve more into the literature. So PCA is simple, as I said. The objective of the PCA is simply data reduction. You're trying to reduce n number of variables to fewer orthogonal pieces. You're trying to account for the maximum variance using minimal components. There's no assumptions of latent factors. You're just trying to find the optimal linear combination of the variables. And let me illustrate what it means geographically to do PCA. So let's assume that we have two variables. We can call them trustworthiness and attractiveness. They're highly correlated, which you would expect. We can compute their mean center, we can compute their variance, and we see that the total variance is 44.8. Okay, now, if I'm doing PCA, I'm trying to find the axis on which to project these two variables. Here's an axis, and the angle is 10 degrees theta. This is completely arbitrary, by the way. But it's for the sake of the example. So let's say I start with the angle of 10 degrees, and in this case, the projection of x1 on the new axis is given by this formula, the cosinus of the angle plus the sinus of the angle with x2. And then now this would be the weights. This would be actually essentially the loadings of these variables with the component. And now I can compute this new variable based on these weights. I can compute its variance. And now I know that this axis accounts about 65% of the variance. This is the variance of the new variable, the axis, which is a linear combination of the original two variables divided by the total variance. What PCA does, it repeats this procedure until it finds the optimal angle. And the optimal angle is the best angle in terms of accounting for the maximum variance. So in this particular TOE example, the optimal angle is about 43 degrees. That's it. Now, here's the optimal angle. I can compute the weights. I can compute the new variable, I mean the principal component, and the variance of this new variable is 38.55. So divided by the total variance, now this axis accounts for 87% of the variance. That's what PCA does. It's pretty transparent and straightforward. And now I can continue finding, the second PC is always orthogonal to the first one because I have two variables and two components. They account for 100% of the variance, but the first one accounts for the vast majority. So what did we do? We projected the two variables into two new axes. The correlation between these two axes is 0, which has some nice properties. And most importantly, now the first component accounts for 87% of the variance. So perhaps we are done. We can just use this weighting of the variables and move on. Instead of using two variables, we can use only this one component. That's what PCA is. Now, factor analysis is a very different game. I mean, people often confuse this because usually principal components is one of the many methods you can use in factor analysis to extract your components, but then you have a rotation. So they're completely different. Theoretically, in the factor analysis, you're identifying latent, unobservable factors that explain the correlations between the variables. So your objective is not to account for the maximum variance, but to account for the observed correlations between the variables. That's what you do. Here's a basic factor model. If you have two factors with 4 variables, and then now we introduce extra parameters. You have the latent factors, but also you have the unique variance of each variable. All of these variables in circles, they're unobservable. So the bottom line is that you have more parameters than data. That's just a factor analysis. And as a result, factor analytic solutions are underdetermined by the data. There's just no unique factor solution. There's two kinds of indeterminacies. The first is indeterminacy due to the estimation of commonality problem, and this is the shared variance between each variable and the factor, and the second is indeterminacy due to the factor rotation problem. So in factor analysis, now I have to partition the variance into shared variance with the common factor and the unique variance. Both of these are latent and unobservable. So to estimate the pattern and structure loadings, this is typically the same unless the factors are not orthogonal. You need to estimate the commonality of each variable. But to estimate the commonality, you need to estimate the loadings. There's a circularity that you cannot, there's no analytic solution, basically. And there's different extraction methods, and they make different assumptions for estimating the commonality. But that's all. There's 6, at least in R right now, there's like 6 different extraction procedures. They deal with this problem. The second one is the factor rotation problem. Because you rotate the factors, there's an infinite number of ways to decompose the commonality of a variable or its shared variance with the factors, and each decomposition will produce a different solution. Here's one, again, another demonstration. Here's a one variable, and then its projection on the two factors, F1 and F2. And from the Pythagorean theorem, this is the commonality of X1. This is the shared variance with the two factors. Now I can rotate these factors, and now we get exactly the same commonality, but it's decomposed, but it's differently decomposed. There are about 20 different rotations, by the way, in, well, there's the big distinction is oblique versus orthogonal, but within this, there are like 20 rotations you can find in R. So there is no unique solution. So what follows from here? Well, one of the implications is that if you're going to compare different factor solutions coming from different groups of participants in particular, you need to align the factor solutions. So you need to have some principal way to go about comparing these different data. And one procedure that is well known is Procrustes rotation that rotates the axis. So if you're comparing two data sets, you need to decide a priori which is your source data set. In our case, that's easy because it's our data. It's a replication of our data. And then you need to align the axis of the matrices you're comparing using this rotation. The Procrustes rotation rotates the axis but preserves the Euclidean distance between the data points. And so so this is just a couple of things. So first, this procedure has been used extensively in various fields. This is a paper in genomics where people do a PCA of geographic diversity and PCA of genetic diversity, and then they do Procrustes rotation and see, well, how much is shared. That's the one application. This is a paper by my former colleague, Jim Hagsby from Princeton, in neuroimaging, and he uses the fancy term of hyperalignment, but the hyperalignment is really using Procrustes rotation to align the functional responses of different brains after participants have been engaged in some complex task. But closer to home, there's a chapter in the handbook of cross-cultural psychology. And I didn't know about any of this, by the way, before the replication came. And much more recent paper, again, Ronald Fisher is the first author in Frontiers, which exactly explains these methods and why you should use them. So this is what we do. First, for each region, we extract two-dimensional PCA and EFA solution. Now, a priori, we have to decide on how many dimensions. In the chapter, we actually discuss what happens if you extract 3 dimensions, because that's the only way to compare the dimensional solutions. And if you're going to test the generalization of a 2-dimensional model, I think it seems like, to me, a simple inference that it's okay to start with the 2-dimensional models. So for each region, we extract 2-dimensional PCA and EFA solution. As I mentioned earlier, this is absolutely essential in the case of EFA, because if I extract a 3-factor solution, the rules of the game change. All of the weights change, and I can't compare these 2 spaces. Within PCA, this is irrelevant because it doesn't really matter. So we do this, then we align the solution for each region to the matrix of our data set using a Procrustes rotation. Then we compute the factor congruence coefficients. And at the end, we run bootstrapping simulations to rule out that the high coefficients are due to the rotation procedure. And I'll get to the critiques of this procedure. So what happens when we do this? Well, for the PCA, everything looks like what it looked at the original report, the replication report, except that the coefficients are not much, but they're higher. So all of the first component would be the same. The second component would be the same in most of the regions. This is also interesting because PCA is robust. Simple methods tend to be robust. So although you don't have any Procrustes rotation in the replication data set, the congruence coefficients are pretty high. If I use this rotation, they get a little bit better, but qualitatively, the interpretation doesn't change. With the EFA, things are completely different. Now, the first factor is the same across every single region, and the second would be very similar or the same in every single region. You have these weird negative coefficients, and that does happen in some procedures with the Middle East. But if you look at the loadings, it's essentially the signs of the variables are reversed. So aggressive and dominance, rather than having positive signs, will have negative signs, and the positive judgment will have a positive sign. And again, if you use a different procedure of Blick rotation, so this is again with Blick rotation allowing for the factors to be correlated, this congruence coefficient will be 909. So it turns out also the rotation procedures, which you use for the regional factor analysis before the comparison is important. And we discussed this in the chapter with Dong Kwon when it comes to 3-factor solutions and with different sorts of rotations. So you have lots of choices that you have to make with factor analysis, and ideally they should have a strong methodological or theoretical rationale why one procedure should be used over another. Now, but there must be problems with this procedure, the Procrustes rotation as a 20 statistical procedure. Indeed, the nature of the procedure could inflate the similarity between different matrices. There are papers from the 70s, and they say, well, we can just take random data and they will become similar. after doing procrustes sortation. That was, I guess, before the time of modern times of when you can run simulations. And the modern treatment is, well, yes, it does inflate similarity. So what do you do with that? Well, one way is you just say, well, forget it. That's not worth using it. But since now it's very cheap and fast and easy to run simulations, the right way is simply to run bootstrapping simulations. And you can look, well, do the observed coefficients that I observe exceed coefficients from randomly shuffled matrices? If they don't, well, you have a problem. There's just the data don't really converge. So this is again what we did with Dongkwon. So we run this 1,000 bootstrapping simulations. So if you look at these points, it's each point here is individual simulations, and these are the frequency distributions, medians, means. What we do, we randomly shuffle the labels within a variable. So if you think each variable is a trait, so within a label, we shuffle the label. So it's not completely randomly shuffling everything, because that would actually make it easier on our end. So we preserve the structure of the data, but we shuffle the labels within a variable. We do this 1,000 times. If a coefficient turns negative, we actually make it positive. And that's why you see this is the reason why the distributions are not symmetric. And so this is also makes it for us harder to say our coefficients, you know, to make it that it's unlikely that our coefficients are generated by chance. So we make it so we try to, in a sense, to stack the odds against us. So what these lines here, the green line is the 99.9 percentile. So that would be corresponds to a significance point p less than 0.001, and a brown one is the second component. In every single region, the observed coefficients are above the 99.9 percentile. In fact, they exceed all of the simulated coefficients. Some get close, but this, remember, 1,000 simulations, right? So you have points that get close. This is for the principal components, but the key is really the factor analysis, because this procedure is absolutely essential for the factor analysis in order to be able to meaningfully estimate these comparisons. And here it's pretty much the same. So what we can say is that it is unlikely, extremely unlikely, that our high congruence coefficients are due to the procrustes rotation. If they were due to the procrustes rotation, they should be somewhere here in the, you know, certainly below at least the 95th percentile. They're above the 99.9 percentile of the data. So let's completely forget about the two-dimensional model, actually, because as I said, I don't really care about the two-dimensional model, and simply look at the similarity of the descriptive data across cultures. I find it striking. I mean, the lowest correlation, I think, where is it? It was like 0.89 between the Middle East and Africa. This is not it's just the existing data. The lowest correlation is 0.89 between Middle East and Africa, and everything else is above 0.90 something. I mean, the range is from 0.89 to 0.99. I find this quite striking. There might be reasons, maybe it's not so interesting because we aggregate data or whatnot, but you need to explain how do you end up with this, granted that I've collapsed this now in a unidimensional space with highly different divergent solutions if I do a factor analysis. So I personally believe that a lot of the cultural variation reported in the EFA replication result is nothing more than statistical noise. I mean, it might be that there is a meaningful cultural variation, but I think that if you follow the procedures I outlined, you cannot see it. And again, this shows you before you make any analytic choices, what sorts of analysis you're going to run or not. This is just straightforward descriptive data. So let me summarize so we have some time for questions, but on the substantive fate, this simplistic two-dimensional model that we formulated more than 10 years ago seems to be remarkably consistent across cultures. Is this the final model? Absolutely no. I mean, I said this several times. If I use a different input of traits, I will end up with different solutions. All I can say is that for the set of 13 traits, you would expect the same 2 dimensions to appear. Claire, who is on the panel, has already done work that if you use a much more diverse set of faces in terms of age, a 3rd dimension emerges, youthfulness, beauty. We didn't find it because our faces didn't vary much in age. There's another work from Australia, I believe Claire was also part of it. If you're evaluating faces of kids, the 2nd dimension is not dominance. So the set of faces, the set of traits, all of this will make will make a difference in what you're going to observe. If I have to bet my money on one prediction, it is that the first principal component or factor will be always about evaluation or valence. And here's my method summary. I believe there should be some transparency between descriptive input data and extracted models. In methods such as PCA, the relationship is completely transparent. When the method is more complex, given the multitude of procedures and assumptions, there should be a strong theoretical rationale for the method and a potential explanation of large differences that seem surprising in light of the descriptive data. Again, as I said, if you're using different methods like PSA and EFA, it doesn't mean that obviously we'll end up with somewhat different models. Fair enough. But the details of the models are not important here. I'm talking about broad claims, whether you have similarity across cultures, whether you have differences. And that to me seemed very strange. If you're starting from the same input data, which show very close convergence, you end up with very different inferences. I would rather trust the descriptive data. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Alex. Can I jump in with a, I guess, point of clarification? If you don't mind going back to the most important slide, which I agree with you. I think it's also the most important slide.
Good.
And in fact, we came up with a figure very like this after we published a paper looking across culture. And I keep thinking we put this figure in our paper and we didn't, and it really annoys me that we didn't, because I think you see the cross-cultural similarities very clearly. But someone asked in the chat as well, can you please explain a bit more about this? I wondered if you've ever thought of ranking the traits instead of alphabetically, but by the weightings on your original PCA? Because I think what you'll see then is a really large cluster of red, where you have all of the traits that are loading heavily on the first factor, and a large cluster, you'll see the factor solution in that matrix, because that's ultimately where it's coming from, or PCA solution.
This is an excellent point. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And yeah, we could have done better reordering the variables, and then the cluster should emerge. You're absolutely right. That's an excellent point. I mean, I have to say this is all my fault. I actually was so focused on running different analysis and using in the Procrustes rotation, and Dongkwon came up with this figure. I mean, it was like, wow. I mean, that's all I need to know. I mean, forget about everything else, whatever your analytic choices you make. So absolutely, that's an excellent point.
So I have another question, if I may, and that's about the fact that all of these techniques which you're describing are linear techniques fundamentally. And I guess something that I'm thinking about is, I don't know, maybe an uneasiness that we're using a linear technique when we know there are potentially non-linearities in the data. So you've shown this in your fMRI papers where, for example, people are more sensitive to discrimination of untrustworthiness relative to trustworthiness. And Dongwon's shown this in differences amongst male and female faces. So I wondered what you thought of that. Do you think it's an issue that our methods, even the correlations, are essentially linear?
I don't know. I'm not. It seems that I'm not sure that it's a big problem here, because if you look at the scatter plots, the relationships are strictly linear. So I'm not really worried. I think it's a much more of an issue when you are talking about modeling. So in fact, if you do, when you build a model of an impression or a judgment, and at some point, if you keep increasing the values or decreasing, you end up with this weird artifact. So once you get outside of the phase space, things are all over. And in our latest work, we're actually using deep neural nets to generate hyper-realistic faces and to manipulate them. And there's lots of non-linearity. And
Cool.
The issue is that once you have this, it's much harder to understand what's going on. Where, you know, with our prior modeling, for everything is linear, so it's easy to understand. And the method seems to be incredibly robust. I mean, one of my favorite papers is by John Dawes, and it's called The Robust Beauty of Linear Models. And I think that linear models do a pretty good job, but this is, I take this point, yeah.
Well, we also ran a nonlinear model when we were trying to predict impressions from new faces in a paper where we modeled physical attributes in the face. And we were quite surprised by how well the linear model did. In fact, actually, we used a neural network approach, but you could get the same result essentially with the regression.
Yeah.
Alex, can I ask an entirely naive question?
Sure, absolutely.
Because I'm not an expert on the statistics or on the research topic, so yeah, it'll sound naive. I'm trying to understand what the important research question is at the far side. I don't mean that as like a criticism or something. I'm just trying to get it. So one way of thinking about it would be, is it surprising that different cultures have any commonalities? Or is it surprising that they are anything other than perfectly the same? And I would have said, because you're trying to argue for ruling in the null, I think, for across cultures. And I would have said, if that's really interesting, that cultures are different, then the people who would study that would care about even an epsilon difference. They don't need it to be big. They just want to show that there's any difference. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm just trying to understand it.
I think that's an excellent point, not a naive question at all. I mean, and I should have outlined the framework better. So, I mean, the broader claim that I'm making here and what is at stake to me, it's a purely methodological question. So, as I said, I would be equally happy if, in fact, there were systematic cultural differences that you can explain. That's total. I have no problem with that. Actually, I don't have stake in whether you should observe cultural differences or not. I find this surprising that we have so much similarity, actually. What the big argument in the frame is that if I'm making different analytic choices, they have to converge in terms of broad claims. So this is what, so the whole thing was a puzzle for me. How is it that if you do a principal components analysis, everything seems nice and perfect and in line with what you observe with the descriptive data, which is this slide right now on the screen, but you run a different analysis and strange things happen. And that, to me, that's what I thought it's a problem. And so if you, methods, even if they're different, they have to converge in their broad conclusions. So this is the claim that, in fact, if it's properly specified, the methods do converge in terms of finding generality. But if the outcome was some differences, that would be just as relevant. But I have no stake at the question. You know, I actually, as I said, I didn't expect that the model will generalize across the world. And there's just, I did expect it will generalize in Western Europe, in US and Canada, in the UK, that in Australia, certainly. But, you know, I had no grounds to say, well, that you would observe it. So the claim is that you should, if you specify a different method, these methods have to converge given the data, unless you make very different assumptions.
Thanks, Alex. I had a couple questions I wanted to ask, which is sort of related to what Leif was just saying. But you know, even though you're showing these correlation matrices and they're very congruent across different cultures, despite that correlation, maybe Dongwan has told you, but Dongwan and I have data looking at these different correlation matrices from the different cultures from the PSA. And then that is correlated with neo-PI personality structure, for example, across different cultures. So if you can there's a small amount of variance that, you know, of course, the goal of the PSA was not to find any kinds of factors that would predict cultural differences, but you can see pretty straightforward cultural differences that are predictable. It's just a small amount of variance. And what I'm wondering, you know, yeah, exactly. So despite all this massive correlation, there is still predictable cross-cultural variability. For example, we find, you know, the neo-PI personality structure and how people are, you know, perceiving their environment. But my bigger question is, you know, as you know, I mean, we've tended to really use representational similarity analysis and essentially just doing correlations or relationships between pairwise similarities, right? And more generally, I mean, what do you, dimensional models, of course, have existed in social cognition for decades, right? And they have a lot of value, of course. But I mean, when we're dealing with this issue of PCA versus EFA, which have different assumptions, of course, what psychologically do you really believe that there are, I mean, which is a stronger assumption of the EFA, that there are two latent variables here of factor one and factor two from a kind of cognitive psychological perspective? Or, I mean, I just always viewed that as sort of a way to characterize the correlation structure. But I mean, is it even important theoretically that we dimensionality reduce, right? I mean, there are ways that you can find theoretically interesting results, for example, and characterize this space while keeping it high dimensional without having to reduce. So I guess now that we're coming to these issues of EFA and PCA, I mean, what is the theoretical value of dimensionality reducing here? You know,
I mean, this is excellent and very general points. So the first point, I absolutely agree. If you looking for difference, you can find them in the chapter. We just played a little bit with multi-dimensional scaling, and we can just say, well, look, all of the quote-unquote Western countries cluster here. So there's definitely differences, but they're probably within the same structure. And they're relatively small given these humongous correlations between the input data. So this, I agree. Then in terms of the bigger questions about dimensionality reduction, I mean, also we have a section on limitations of these dimensional models. I actually think they're largely descriptive and they have little predictive power. So if I'm trying to predict how an impression will influence a decision, it's better to know what's the specific impression. And if it's competence, you better measure perceptions of competence than look at these dimensional models. I think they have value in terms of if you find commonality across many, many different domains and cultures, maybe there is something universal or interesting about these dimensions. But they're largely descriptive. And the issue when we use PCA or EFA, I mean, if you have a very specific model that posits latent factor, and that's how traditionally, you know, factor analysis can be used. You have a model of generalized intelligence, so you have a model of specific abilities. Well, that's how you go and test it. But if you don't have a model, especially if you say, well, now I can extract here 2-dimension, I can extract 3-dimension. So if you have a strong theoretical model that posits that you have a number of factors, that's the right technique, I suppose. And with the PCA, we didn't have we didn't have a model in mind. We're just interested in dimensionality reduction. So it really depends on your question.
Mm-hmm. Can I quickly, oh no, go ahead.
Oh yeah, why don't you ask your last question? We're at the end of our time, but John, it'd be great if you could follow up.
Well, I just want to, you know, the way that it's interesting to hear your thinking now, Alex, in terms of just because the way I sort of interpreted the 2008 paper was, you know, the functional basis of face evaluation in the sense that, you know, it was a PCA, so it's not formally arguing for latent variables, of course, but that these are functionally adaptive dimensions that we have presumably evolved to track. I mean, generally consistent with things like the stereotype content model and the models you talked about, you know, for a very long time. Do you feel like that? Because there I see a theoretical prediction of there might be even to, you know, cognitive neural systems that are producing this correlation structure.
Yeah, I mean,
it seems like you feel differently though now about that.
I mean, again, with hindsight, now I looked at these dimensions, they were like the best signal in terms of what kinds of models to build later. And we had a story about the functional value of these dimensions. And I think that now now if you really interested in this kind of a model, yeah, that would be the right way to test it more rigorously with positing factors and latent factors. And so so I mean, it's not that I feel differently, but as I said, in a sense, we happen to use these 13 different traits. If you use a much larger set of traits, I mean, the kinds of traits you're going to use will determine the kinds of dimensions you're going to observe. And that's just a really, really the most important questions when you're doing this sorts of analysis.
Thank you.
Can I just add one sentence? I mean, on the theoretical import, I think it's always useful to go back to the fact that these methods are so tied in with modeling the structure of the face and ultimately the identity of the face. So we have a recent paper on convolutional neural networks and trait analysis of faces, and the model is optimized to do identification, and yet we see a really strong representation of the trait information because how you look specifies both your unique existence as an identity as well as all these other social things, and the relationship between those two things I think is, you know, theoretically fascinating. So I think it's important to see cross-culturally whether or not that holds up and in what ways. And I have a ton of things to say about the methods, but our time is up, but I feel your pain, Alex. I've seen these problems before in spaces, and I have always stuck with PCA because the space and ultimately the most important slide here represents your best look at the structure of the space. And as soon as you start throwing it in all these crazy models that are rotating and stuff, it gets dangerous fast.
I agree.
And we'll stop there, and I want to just thank Alex and all of our panelists for joining us from all over the world. It's been really great, Alex, really interesting, and barring anything unusual, we will get this video of the recording of this posted to YouTube so you can share it with all of your friends who weren't able to make it here today. But thanks to all of you for joining, and yeah, everyone have a good weekend.
Thank you everybody.